Welcome back to Face the Nation. We're joined now by Washington Post Associate Editor Bob Woodward and CBS Chief Election and Campaign Correspondent Robert Costa. These are the reporters responsible for that scoop about Clarence Thomas's wife's efforts to overturn the 2020 elections. Good morning to both of you.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here. Bob Woodward, I'll start with you. Congressman Kinzinger was not forthcoming. He barely admitted that these exist. Why are these texts so important?
Well, because they come after the election is over. And the general rule and things like the Constitution and the law say there's going to be one thing that happens after the election is over, and that is the certification before Congress when the Vice President, the President of the Senate presides. And so this is, I'm sorry to go back to this. We were talking earlier about Watergate, but Watergate was about tampering with the electoral process at the front. Nixon and his underlings mounted a massive sabotage and espionage campaign against the Democrats. But this is after the election, and people who believe in the Constitution and the law would say, okay, it's over. You can go to court, but you read, when Robert and I were reading these texts at the beginning, it was almost unbelievable that you would have somebody in Ginny Thomas's position say, quote, others saying, in war, there is no rule. There are no rules, that this is warfare. Well, it shouldn't be.
And Bob Costa, this brings in another branch of government into this tangentially. I mean, she's married to a Supreme Court justice, so that's the other element of this as well.
What Bob Woodward and I have found is this campaign spearheaded by then-President Trump that played out in the post-election period across all three branches of government in at least tangential ways. You had Congress working with President Trump to try to block the certification of President-elect Biden at the time. You had the president pressuring state lawmakers. You had the spouse of a Supreme Court justice communicating with the White House chief of staff. And you had the executive branch doing everything possible to have a legal challenge that would maybe go all the way, as Trump said, to the Supreme Court. This was Trump pulling every lever of power, and one of those levers, it appears to be, was his own chief of staff at least communicating on legal strategy with the spouse of a justice.
I want to stay on the Supreme Court issue with you, Bob. One of your books is about the Supreme Court. Chief Justice John Roberts is very concerned about judicial independence. He wrote at the end of last year in his letter from the Chief Justice, the judiciary's power to manage its internal affairs insulates the courts from inappropriate political influence and is crucial to preserving public trust. The idea that if the court is seen as political, its rulings won't have the weight in American life that it should.
Well, he really has grounds for being worried. Now, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, 6 months ago, went to the McConnell Center in Kentucky, which is the center Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Republicans, set up, and she made a remarkable speech. She said, I want to prove to you that we are not a bunch of partisan hacks in the Supreme Court. And she said, all justices must be hyper-vigilant to make sure they're not letting personal biases creep into their decision, since justices and judges are people too. So she made it very clear that this hyper-vigilance should be the condition in which justices operate. We now have a situation where the wife of a justice has gone on a crusade and has said, this is warfare, do not concede. The White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, himself said, this fight is good versus evil.
Yeah. And you have an instance where the Supreme Court justice was overseeing cases related to January 6th and May again, and didn't recuse himself. Bob Costa, I want to get your sense of these texts. Do they give us a flavor for the kinds of things the committee has? What does this tell us about the work of the January 6th committee in terms of putting together this picture of what President Trump was doing and what those acting in his name were trying to do to overturn the election?
John, your interview with Congressman Kinzinger referenced how they have Mark Meadows' text messages to a point, and they are frustrated that for at least the Thomas exchanges, based on our reporting, they do end in late November. And where are the text messages, if any, from December or around January 6th? But at the same time, it's important to note that based on our reporting, that the Meadows text messages do provide, to a point, a roadmap of sorts of some of the things that were being done by the White House Chief of Staff, then President Trump, during this post-election period. They've also done hundreds of interviews. They have thousands of pages of documents from different people who are cooperating with the committee. But they still feel, in many ways, they do not have enough. Steve Bannon has refused to cooperate. Mark Meadows has now refused to cooperate. So the question facing that Congressman Kinzinger and others is, where's the John Dean who's going to put the hand in the air and start outlining all of these different facets?
You think there's any John Dean around, Bob?
There are always surprises, as we find in this. And remember, the January 6th committee, in a filing in California, has said they have a good faith conclusion that Trump and people around him engaged in a full-fledged criminal conspiracy to overturn the election. They rule this as criminal. And if you go back 100 years to the Supreme Court, it was Chief Justice Taft, of all people, saying, we're not going to let people meddle with things like the certification on January 6th, which is in the law. So much is hinging on the committee's effort. I think Robert and I found they're really working hard. They're talking to people, that there is an aggressiveness and a sense of expanding the universe of likely witnesses.
But a real test is going to be, will they ask Ginny Thomas to appear first voluntarily? If they don't ask her to appear voluntarily, are they going to the full extent they can to find the truth? Or will they issue a subpoena? The challenge here is, like any investigation, things go in different directions. Will you pursue all leads or not?
And Ginny Thomas is not just about what she may have said, but what she was on the listening end of. I mean, she has material that she can provide about what Mark Meadows was saying and others she was talking to.
We just don't have the full picture at this point about her relationship with Justice Thomas and his knowledge of her exchanges with the Chief of Staff.
Well, we have a little bit more of the picture because of the two of you. So thanks so much to both of you for being here, and we'll be back in a moment. We're joined now by Will Hurd. He's a former Republican congressman from Texas, a former CIA officer, and now the author of American Reboot. Congressman, welcome.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be on.
The book begins with a very exciting, I won't spoil it, but moment in your CIA career. So I want to use that intelligence to talk about intelligence. What does your intelligence background tell you about what's happening in Ukraine right now?
Look, right now it tells me that something I learned in those almost decade as an undercover officer, where I was responsible for recruiting spies and stealing secrets. When it comes to our foreign policy, we want our friends to love us and our adversaries to fear us. And when you use that as a metric on looking at what's happening in Ukraine, our allies, President Zelensky, is asking us to do more. Our adversaries, our enemies, Vladimir Putin, is launching cruise missiles into the western part of the Ukraine because he's not afraid that we're going to respond. We need to be doing more. And I think that because we can help prevent an incredible loss of life.
Quickly, doing more meaning what?
Look, I think we should be giving them as much weaponry as we can. What we don't know, in the earlier segment you talked about, is 20 MiGs going to be enough to do anything? Well, everybody underestimated the Ukrainians before this happened. Who knows what they're going to be able to do with those kinds of tools? And we have to be prepared to help them prevent significant loss of life.
The other piece of your expertise I want to tap is cyber. You write about it in the book. President Biden this week said to American business leaders, be careful, harden your targets more than you already have been. What could the Russians do?
Look, the Russians can do a lot of things. They could impact water treatment plants. We've already seen that happen in the United States last summer. They could try to impact our grid. We saw in my home state of Texas, the grid, it was because the grid went down or almost went down because of weather issues. But you can mimic that similar kinds of attack through a digital attack. And so the world is incredibly interconnected. In increasing things like artificial intelligence is going to be the future of cybersecurity, where you're going to have bad AI versus good AI, and this is moving at a significant speed.
Why hasn't the Russian cyber attack happened the way people expected?
I think the Russians are not 10 feet tall. I think that's one of the things that we learned from this. They thought that this campaign and this invasion of Ukraine would be going differently. The fact that the FSB, which is responsible for a lot of their cyber activities, they're rounding some of them up and using them as scapegoats as why the attacks are going so poorly. So I think they've been consumed and they haven't been able to get to it.
All right, let's turn the wheel now and talk about your book. One of the arguments you make in your book is that the Republican Party needs to reach out to those portions of the electorate that haven't traditionally been Republicans. So with that in mind, as you watch the confirmation hearings of Judge Jackson this week, how do you think the Republican Party fared with its representatives questioning her towards the larger purpose of your book?
Well, look, I think what's crazy here, this is a seminal moment, right? Yes, I disagree with the judge's judicial philosophy, but she's obviously qualified. And the fact that she's, I think, the second most popular justice ever nominated to the bench, that should be the story, all right, when it comes to this. Of course, a handful of senators acted like jokers in their testimony and they're asking questions. Similarly, other senators have done in other nominations for Supreme Court justices. But my point in the book is that the Republican Party needs to start looking like America, because we have a real opportunity. The Republicans are going to take back the House in 2022. And we're primarily going to take back the House because of the incompetence of the Democratic Party. Imagine that instead of voting because voters think the other guys are so bad, that they're voting for us because they believe in our ideas. We're going to see some of that happen in my home state in South Texas, where you're going to see Latinos vote for Republicans in probably record numbers.
So I want to press on that theory. Your argument is essentially the Republican Party has to catch up with where America is going, a constituency different than the one that they support. And you refer back to the Republican autopsy after the 2012 loss. And in that autopsy, they said Republicans have to embrace comprehensive immigration reform, stop sending the message that we only care essentially about white voters. Donald Trump heard that and said, nuts. I'm going to run the opposite, and he won. And now, as you say, Republicans are ready to perhaps take over the House and the Senate. That seems like a pretty strong argument against essentially your argument.
Sure. Well, Donald Trump did win, but then he also lost. He lost the House. He lost the Senate, right? And so there was, and then if we look in 2020, Joe Biden won, and he had absolutely no coattails, because the public said, hey, we don't like some of these things the Democratic Party is going to. So yes, a good chunk of the Republican Party is still blindly loyal to President Trump, but it's not the supermajority. And this is the opportunity that we have. And this is where we need to be thinking about this in 2022 and the opportunities that we have in order to grow and improve our electoral successes.
There is a question about the power that Donald Trump has in the party. You say the first thing that Republicans have to do is admit that the 2020 election was legitimately decided in favor of Joe Biden. That's not the majority position, according to polls among Republicans.
Sure, but when I crisscross the country now in promoting the book American Reboot, one of the things that I've learned, people say, yeah, let's get beyond that. Let's move on. Joe Biden is the president, right? Let's start talking about the next thing. So for me, look, I'm talking about where we should be going. We are at a moment where 72% of Americans think the country is on the wrong track. And this is not new. This has been going on for some time. And what I'm trying to say is we don't have to accept the current trajectory. There's different ways of doing things. And I try to use my time from when I was in the CIA, in business, and in Congress to outline a different strategy.
All right, Congressman Hurt, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And we'll be back in a moment. We want to turn back now to the war in Ukraine and welcome the former U.S. ambassador to that country, Marie Yovanovitch. She is the author of a new memoir, Lessons from the Edge. Good morning, Ambassador.
Good morning.
President Biden, 3 days in Europe, Brussels, and then went to Poland. What did you make of that visit?
I thought it was a hugely important trip where the president was able to demonstrate not only American leadership, but Western unity in this hugely important challenge that Russia has inflicted on Ukraine, but more broadly on the West.
He talked about unity. How fragile is that unity? Because it seems like everybody's saying all the right things. How fragile? Is it so fragile the president must go and make a visit to keep it together?
I think 1 month in, there was a symbolic effect, but there were also a lot of accomplishments that were cited during the various summits. So this was NATO, but it was also the European Union, it was the G7. And then obviously the trip to Poland, where he met with President Duda, as well as Ukrainian refugees, as well as the 82nd Airborne, and of course, importantly, the Ukrainian defense and foreign ministers. So I think a lot was accomplished there. And a lot of announcements were made. You know, more humanitarian assistance, the 100,000 slots for refugees, more military groups going out to Europe, and the list goes on.
The 100,000 refugees that Biden said that America would take, how important is that in talking to Europeans who are the one? I mean, Poland is taking the brunt of the refugees. How important is that in terms of showing that America is pulling its weight, for lack of a better term?
Shouldering the burden and being supportive. I think it's important, but honestly, my own opinion is that it's just a start. Because when you've got up to 10 million, and perhaps the numbers are even higher this morning, 10 million displaced people out of Ukraine, about 3.5 in Europe, 100,000 doesn't begin to really start to approach the kind of figures that we're probably going to need to show. That said, though, many Ukrainian people aren't looking to come to the U.S. or even to Western Europe. They want to stay close because they want to go back and rebuild. I mean, it's really inspiring.
You have contacts there. You live there. You tell me what you're hearing from within Ukraine.
Well, they're kind of encouraging me. When I express concerns and worry, they're saying, "Don't worry, we've got this. We are gonna keep on fighting," and they are. And they're asking for our help. And so just recently I got an email from one of my former bodyguards who he said, Madam Ambassador, I would never ask for myself, but I really, I need equipment for my team. I need, medical kits, I need body armor, I need boots. And so I tried to hook him up with some people who could provide that.
How do they read the statements by President Biden and other Americans who say, we're with you, we're with you, we're with you, except to the border?
Yeah. Well, you can imagine that on the one hand, perhaps at a very high level, they understand that we have Article 5 responsibilities under the NATO treaty. But on the other hand, they wish that we would do more. I think we are doing a lot. But I think we need to keep on backfilling when it comes to security assistance because the Ukrainians are using everything that we and other countries are providing, but we need to keep on backfilling it because it's being used.
As a career diplomat, how do you read, and your expertise is not just Ukraine, but Russia as well, how do you read this Donbass move from the Russians, the idea that the public statement is they're going to focus on Donbass? Does that have an effect in terms of diplomacy? In other words, could some countries say, okay, well, it's not pretty, but we'll give them Donbass just so we can be done with this war?
Yeah, I think, so perhaps, but I think that what we've learned over the last month and a half or several months, if not the last 20 years, is that we can't always trust what the Russians are saying. So they made that statement, and then a day or so later, they attacked Lviv in the far west of Ukraine, very far away from the Donbass. Right. So I think we need to wait and see.
There is an incredibly prescient moment in your book where you talk about U.S. not really reading Vladimir Putin right, and you predict, this is before any of this happened, quote, "We will someday, maybe soon, find ourselves in a serious confrontation in a context not of our choosing and not to our advantage." So building on that platform, how is the interpretation, the West's interpretation or America's interpretation of Putin, how are we getting him right at this moment, and how should we think about the way he sees things?
Yeah. You know, that is the question of the moment, isn't it? And I think it's hard to know. It was always hard to know, but especially now after COVID and the isolation that he finds himself in with just a very small group of advisors, people who've been with him, you know, since KGB, you know, St. Petersburg days. And there's just not a lot we know about what kind of advice he's getting or what he knows. But I do think that Putin is a man who only understands strength. And so when, you know, right now the Biden administration is trying to navigate this very narrow lane of supporting Ukraine on the one hand, standing up for our values and our interests, but also doing the utmost not to expand the war. And when we look at that as a positive thing, that this is restrained and positive, I think sometimes perhaps Vladimir Putin looks at it as a sign of weakness. And so, again, this is a very difficult lane to navigate. And right now, I think the Biden administration is doing a pretty good job of it. But obviously, it requires constant calibration and recalibration in terms of what's going on the ground.
I want to get to something you wrote about in your book. You talked about chauvinism at the State Department, how there were no female role models. This week, Madeleine Albright, the first female Secretary of State, died. You served under her. Tell me about that experience and how important it was to have a woman in that role.
Well, she broke that glass ceiling, and once you have one, you're going to have another one. And she was a role model, I think, for many of us. I was very junior when she was Secretary of State, but she was a pioneer as the first woman Secretary of State. She was, as an immigrant to this country from, in fact, I think a refugee from Eastern Europe, war-torn Eastern Europe. She was a strong voice for democracy and human rights and for Ukraine. And so I got to know her just a little bit. It was a privilege when she visited Ukraine while I was there as ambassador. And she, very kindly took time out to speak with me and provide advice and encouragement.
All right, Marie Yovanovitch, Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. Margaret Brennan returns next week on Face the Nation.